Dear audience, welcome to the show POWERchat. In today's episode, this is the 142nd episode of the POWERchat. We are discussing about the safety threats to journalists in Asia, with particular focus on the pandemic economic downturn, that of the COVID-19, and ways addressing the issues of journalists and journalism in Asia. Joining me today, Mr. Nonoy Espina. He is the chairman of National Union of Journalists of the Philippines. He's joining us from the Philippines. Also, I'm joined today by Ms. Aliya Iftikhar. She is the senior researcher at Asia program of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I'm also joined today by Ms. Elisabeth Witchel. She worked as a consultant with different organizations, including CPJ, and she brings knowledge on freedom of expression and press freedom with her experience in Asia and South Asia. We also invited Mr. Faisal, but for technical reasons he could not join us. I'd like to welcome all of you in the show POWERchat. Welcome to the show, Mr. Nonoy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Ms. Aliya and Ms. Elisabeth.
Thank you.
Elisabeth is joining us from the United Kingdom, and Aliya Iftikhar is joining us from the United States. I'm starting from Mr. Nonoy Espina. You are leading the National Network of Journalists in the Philippines, National Union of Journalists of the Philippines. How are you observing the situation of journalists? What are the particular threats or safety issues that journalists are facing in your country, Mr. Nonoy?
Well, in the Philippines, journalism has always been a very, very dangerous department. In fact, since 1986, when we kicked out the dictator and supposedly got back our democracy, we have lost 186 journalists murdered. And right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic, but it seems the government is actually using the pandemic as cover to crack down freedom of the press and of free expression. We have already had our biggest network, ABS-CBN, shut down by government. And we have the online outfit, Rappler, facing a barrage of lawsuits, and their CEO, Maria Reza, already convicted in cyber libel. And basically, we're all under pressure from our government with a new anti-terrorism law passed. So this is a very, to put it mildly, is a very delicate stage in our country right now.
Well, Elisabeth, do you see there are changes in relations to the safety of journalists because of the COVID-19? You know, many journalists in the countries like Nepal and India, they are, forced to quit their jobs, and especially from the big media houses. What do you think? How should the stakeholders work on protecting journalists from the dual kind of safety threats, that of the physical safety from the state and non-state actors? Now from the media owners, they are asked to stay at home and without pay and all. How can we address these challenges facing by the journalists?
Kind of great challenges to, when you're talking about safety of journalists, actually does come from within media houses, and journalists often are not provided with the kind of safety nets they need. They're often employed in kind of tenuous contracts or situations that make them professionally vulnerable. So these are, I think, situations that have gone on a long time in some countries, and journalists in many places do work under conditions that create a kind of level of danger, or they're not provided with the training or the kind of safety protocols. So all of that needs to be examined by media houses. There needs to be kind of a greater attention to the safety routine, looking at protective equipment, looking at what reporters might be at greater risk of catching COVID, and some attention to kind of the psychological well-being, because there's a lot of exposure to trauma and stress in covering this. And then when you're talking about kind of employment insecurity, it is a kind of, it's a very, very difficult time for many journalists. So they, there needs to be a lot more support given to media houses. There needs to be a lot of innovation to making sure that media survives, and that they, if part of that solution is, say, involving kind of public-private funding models that might involve grants, part of those discussions and part of the criteria really need to include how journalists their safety is provided for and their job security is provided for in some way.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth, for your introductory remarks on the safety of journalists in Asia. I'm going with Aliya Iftikhar. She's working with the Committee to Protect Journalists as Asia Program Senior Researcher. How is CPJ observing the safety threats faced by journalists in Asia? Aliya Iftikhar.
Yeah, we're very concerned, and I think that Elisabeth touched on a number of the trends that we are seeing in terms of the threats to press freedom, especially as a result of the pandemic, and those include the physical attacks, arrests, and harassment, as well as legal restrictions and criminalization of journalism, either through the emergency regulations, I think, like Elisabeth touched on, fake news laws, but we're also seeing increased censorship and restrictions on access to information, fewer news briefings, fewer officials providing comment or offering official statistics and data, which are extremely important. And if this crisis has made anything clear, it's that reliable information is really crucial, and journalists are very crucial. And it's also a matter of safety and public health, in addition to just access to information.
Well, Aliya, at the beginning, Nonoy from Philippines was mentioning that many journalists were killed, threatened, and the environment is not conducive on the legal policy formation and all. How are you observing this situation? Any country-specific observation of the Asian countries or in South Asia that you are interacting and working with the stakeholders, and what particular recommendations that you want to do on the safety of journalists, especially that arising from the COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think, like we heard from Nonoy, he was saying that the threats to journalists in the Philippines have been there for many decades. This is not something that's new. This is an ongoing trend. And Elisabeth, I think, also mentioned, that many of the concerns and trends that we're seeing right now existed prior to the pandemic. They've just been exacerbated. And we're seeing governments and authorities taking advantage of the pandemic in order to further crack down on the free press. So within Asia, we're seeing the same trends. Each country is different, of course. Each country has its own set of challenges and concerns, but broadly, the threats in terms of physical attacks, in terms of restrictions on access, in terms of legal restrictions or fake news legislations, those are trends that we're seeing across South Asia, across Asia. And, the broad recommendation would be that governments need to be transparent. They need to be providing access to information. They need to be allowing journalists to do their jobs without any restrictions, without any interference. And then, of course, with each country and its own unique challenges, there would be concerns that we raise directly with them. But we have been, raising these concerns directly with governments, directly with local stakeholders, local partners, and along with the United Nations, the EU, the US government.
Well, thank you, Aliya. I'm going with Nonoy again. Nonoy, you said that journalists face extreme threats from the state and non-state actors in Philippines. Is there any change the journalist facing problems resulting from the COVID-19? Any professional safety related issues arising from the media houses in Philippines, or the trend remains same?
Like everyone's been saying, I think the pandemic has made things worse for everyone. And in terms of like, look, when the government shut down ABS-CBN, it threatened the jobs of more than 11,000 people. And these people have families, and plus the accessory businesses that depend on the network's operation. But even in the communities, our friends in the Philippine Press Institute, which is the Association of Newspapers, the last conversation I had, they reported that at least 13 community papers had shut down operations in print and gone online, which means layoffs in production and layoffs in news staff. So we are facing that worsening situation. I do know that some of the major newspapers are also poised to lay off workers. And aside from that, we have this new anti-terror law, which actually has the potential of targeting free expression by this new offense called inciting to terrorism, which basically covers anything you can do or say. So it is a dangerous situation where, like has been said, government is taking advantage of the health crisis to actually crack down on rights.
Are you working with the media houses, addressing these problems, or you seeking some legal supports for those who lost their jobs? Here in Nepal, there are similar cases. Around 2,000 journalists are directly affected by the COVID-19, not by COVID-19 actually, but by the media houses. They were forced to stay at home or quit jobs. So are you considering to, check with or seek legal remedies for this, or are you interacting with the media houses? What is your experience, very quickly, Nonoy?
Well, in some cases, yes, we do engage with the media houses, with the owners, but these are very rare cases because basically the Philippine media industry is commercial in nature, and there is always that conflict. There is always that tension between the working journalists, the media workers, and managements. And we've had cases filed against media houses that illegally lay off their workers. But in the case of the pandemic, it's kind of hard to make demands when everyone is actually feeling the pinch, including the owners, to be fair. So we're still actually trying to find our way around this, and try to find ways where we can get media owners who are already beleaguered as it is to provide more support for their workers. Well, it's not an easy job.
Thank you. Elisabeth, could you recommend with any specific ideas how stakeholders, especially that of the media right organizations in the respective countries in Asia, need to work at the moment addressing the dual type of challenges media workers are facing, that of the long run impunity index and now arising from the COVID-19?
Yes, well, I think since you mentioned impunity, one thing that I think is worrying is that some of that work got pushed aside or put on the back burner. So one important thing is that, as the media and freedom of expression communities are able to come out and be more active, that they don't forget, they don't let commitments lie, they don't let older cases of journalists who've been attacked or killed languish. So although we have all of these other pressing threats, I think that there's a great danger that some of the strong work that people have done, particularly in the Philippines, in pushing for justice, doesn't get forgotten about or become low priority. It really does have to be brought back up. So that would be one thing. I think that in several countries there's been some very strong efforts to bring stakeholders together into frameworks, so that there's a Philippines plan of action for safety of journalists that involves multiple stakeholders, and I think this is exactly the kind of situation that sort of coalition should be designed for. It involves owners, it involves government representatives, it involves journalists, and it involves civil society groups, and that is the kind of framework that I think, if used properly, can be really valuable if in really working out, joint solutions, and can also engage, the international community as needed. I would say in Nepal, some of the efforts to promote a journalist safety mechanism through the National Human Rights Commission is another, initiative that's, I think, was starting to pick back up just before COVID set in, and that's another particular project that, I hope does not become a victim of its own to the pandemic.
Well, Elisabeth, what best mechanism could be, in place for countries in Asia protecting journalists from both physical and professional safety threats?
I think there is no single mechanism. I think it has to be a kind of combination of developing prevention and protective measures that are sort of more traditional approaches to physical safety, but it also but we also need to have strong joint campaigning to protect, to advocate for the appropriate legislation and to advocate for justice. And then the kind of other tier is that there needs to be work that ensures that the media that a media development takes place, and that takes place that there's promotion of good standards, that there's promotion of good employment practices, and that and that journalists are free to do their jobs without feeling at risk, both from state and non-state actors.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. I'm going with Aliya Iftikhar of the CPJ. What are the legal or policy issues that the stakeholders take as challenges to the principles and instruments on freedom of expression that many countries in this region are state party to, especially that of the instruments on freedom of expression? Are you observing from the CPJ the legal reforms taking place in the countries? For example, in Nepal, there are many policy and legal changes at the moment addressing the free press and all. Any specific observation of the countries in this region, Aliya?
Yeah, I think there are many changes that are being proposed in numerous countries, but if we're looking and thinking about Nepal specifically, in the past year alone, there have been several proposed legislations that would, be detrimental to press freedom in the country. And I think one of the things that Nepal does really well is it has a very well organized coalition of journalists that are very aware of these threats, and they mobilize and they advocate against these changes. And I would say that the government really does need to pay heed to those concerns, and really also need to have conversations with journalists and media organizations within the country to address reasons. I mean, one of the great things about Nepal is that press freedom is really enshrined in its constitution, and that's certainly not something that I think we or journalists in the country or in the region would like to see go away.
Well, but at the same time, there are laws, proposed by the parliament, especially that of the Penal Code, and then in proposed Information Technology Act, which the stakeholders in Nepal and abroad consider, obstacles to free press. How can stakeholders work on that, and how can CPJ support to ongoing discourse here in Nepal and outside?
Yeah, so I think that's what I was referring to. So especially with proposals like the Information and Technology Act, legislations, that are essentially hitting at broader crimes or trying to address broader concerns, but have specific components inside them, essentially almost hidden, that would harm or be detrimental to press freedom, are very concerning. We have been, in touch with local partners, with journalists on the ground. We have been also advocating against those proposals, but we very much, I think, take our cue from our partners, from the journalists on the ground, on what would they like to see, what would they hope to see either amended or removed from those proposals. And we, try to amplify and uplift those concerns. I personally, have tried to also raise those concerns directly with the government, and we also raise it within, at the US government, at the State Department levels, with the EU or the UN, to try to add some pressure. But largely, I think that there's a lot of well-documented concerns. I think that the local journalists have raised those concerns directly with the government as well, and had direct face-to-face interactions and meetings. And I think that the government really should be operating in good faith and taking those concerns into account, and also, adhering to their own constitution, which really values press freedom.
Well, thank you, Aliya. I'm going back to Nonoy. Nonoy, you were referring to the cases of, threats against journalists in Philippines. How are you assessing the situation of impunity? Impunity, when you talk about Nepal, it's a living reality. Many journalists were killed during the time of conflict, but the perpetrators are not booked. Any specific mechanism or initiatives that is taking place in Philippines, the other countries can also learn in the region, addressing the issue of impunity in the cases of media freedom? Nonoy.
Well, in the case of impunity, I don't think we would be the model country to look to. Impunity here is a major problem. Like of the 186 journalists murdered since 1986, aside, of course, from the convictions in the Maguindanao massacre, we have had only like less than 20 convictions. And these convictions have only been of the gunmen. Hardly any mastermind has ever been caught and brought to court. So that means a lot of cases really remain unsolved. And in the case of laws against that go against press freedom and the freedom of expression, of course, we're one of the few countries left. I think we're the only country left with criminal libel, where libel is still a criminal offense. And in fact, when they passed the anti-cybercrime law, they included the offense of cyber libel, which is basically just libel committed on the internet, and applied double the penalty to cyber libel than to libel committed through other means. And as we all know, libel is a favorite weapon of politicians and businessmen to harass journalists. In fact, just recently, a senator who is actually the former aide of President Duterte has filed complaints with law enforcement against citizens who shared critical posts on Facebook. And so now they're being investigated for posts, but the subpoena sent to them didn't even identify which posts these were. And one of them is a journalist. And so we're kind of worried that with the pandemic, with the anti-terrorism law, and with all the libel laws, they are out to, to shut us up, basically, or scare us into silence.
Nonoy, are you saying that the laws relating to libel or that of the self-censorship are not up to the international standards and that violate the principles of freedom of expression and media freedom?
Definitely not. In fact, the United Nations has said that our libel laws are really detrimental to free speech and to freedom of the press. But no matter how hard we have lobbied our Congress, no one has ever, none of the bills that have been filed to decriminalize libel have ever taken off. And so we're still stuck with criminal libel up to now.
Well, Elisabeth, why is so environment fragile, despite the fact that organizations are working with the stakeholders, state and non-state actors in the region? Why countries are not willing, the governments are not willing to take this issue seriously? What do you think?
Well, I think that a lot of, in many countries, the kind of strategy has shifted. So governments, I think, are responding on a certain level to some of the campaigning that's gone on. So if you take Impunity's example, you see many governments taking steps on some level, and you could maybe describe them as superficial or a kind of lip service. Or, for example, in the Philippines, they established multiple task forces, and some have had some results, but certainly not on a level that's, I think, most freedom of expression campaigners would be happy with. And so you kind of see a kind of response to these more physical violence, the more extreme attacks of murder, and then we see an increase in these kind of less blunt ways of repressing journalists. So I think throughout many countries in the world, and certainly I think in Asia, and Aliya can probably give some more concrete examples, but I know at least in Pakistan and the Philippines, you see this kind of extreme legal harassment, or the use, and in India as well, the use of economic pressure or political pressure on advertisers, and all of these kind of more complex, but I think less sort of shocking in a kind of newsworthy sense. These strategies that are just chipping away and weakening the media, or at least challenging the media. So what we've seen is a bit of a response from governments, I think, to the increase in pressure that has come through national and international campaigning, but then a kind of strengthening in how governments repress the media in more, I want to say subtle ways, but I think it's becoming not so subtle as time goes on. But certainly not, we're seeing in some places, we're seeing a lot less, less violence, physical violence, but then the use of all these other kind of tools and, online harassment as well, as another way of silencing critics. And as to why, I think because, we are seeing a kind of broader trend towards authoritarianism in many places, and including in Europe and North America, as well as in Asia. So, I think the great risk, what is really concerning at the moment is whether we're kind of seeing an acceptance of that authoritarianism in the name of safety, kind of broadly speaking. Name of safety under, in this time of a pandemic when, people are kind of putting this sense of physical safety before maybe principles of democracy.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for your insights on ending impunity. Aliya, what is CPJ doing with the stakeholders, and who do you think needs to be more responsible in ending impunity, that of the conflict-induced impunities in different countries of the Asia region, including Nepal and Philippines?
So, in every country, CPJ engages with various stakeholders, from local journalists to local media organizations to local unions, other press freedom and human rights organizations. And in each country, the strategy is different. But in terms of combating impunity and whose responsibility it is, I mean, that falls on the governments to ensure that perpetrators are brought to account and held responsible. When that doesn't happen, and I mean, Elisabeth is the expert here on impunity, but when that doesn't happen, it allows that cycle of violence to continue, and it's almost a tacit endorsement that attacks against journalists, attacks against the press will be allowed to happen.
Well, thank you, Aliya. But I'm putting one more question on you, that of the gender dimensions. How are you observing the situation of women journalists in the region? Any specific challenges that women journalists face in Asia region, and what are the ways you are trying to address them?
Of course, I mean, women journalists in Asia and across the world face unique threats and challenges in their ability to do their work. There are many sort of gendered threats and attacks that they can face. Many of them can be seen in, just vitriolic online harassment, the kind of rape threats or very, sexual violence that can be directed towards women journalists. And it's very tough, but what we do is try to document and understand the threats that they're facing, the unique challenges that women journalists may be facing, directly engage with them on what kind of support that those journalists may need, try to raise better awareness about gender threats, gender dynamics, how to create healthier workspaces for women, how media houses can take better precautions to, provide safety for women journalists, and there can be trauma support. There's a whole wealth of ways that, I think media organizations can be doing to better support their female staff.
Well, I'm going with Elisabeth on the same question. Do you think that the newsrooms and the safety initiatives in Asia region are gender friendly? What are your recommendations, making them not only gender friendly but ensuring that women journalists in newsroom and outside do not face any kind of harassment because of their gender identity? Elisabeth.
So I think that needs to take place on many levels. So you need, if you're starting with, say, a newsroom, there needs to be a few things in place. Very strong sexual harassment protocols against sexual harassment, and then you also need gender equality protocols as well, or principles as employment practices. But then you also need a newsroom that considers the gender-specific threats female journalists face in risk assessments, but also in assessing and responding to online harassment. So, these need to be kind of brought into the newsroom culture on a much more holistic way. And then as far as the safety initiatives go, I think that we are starting to see, certainly in some of the multi-stakeholder forums, a lot more focused attention on, how to bring what I think you often see described as a gender-specific approach to safety and understand bringing different gender aspects to the safety, whether it's providing women-only pathways for emergency responses, whether it's increasing, promoting awareness of legal standards and behavior standard and harassment standards, and as well as ensuring that from the top of a country's political culture, is a demeaning language isn't used, that you don't see that a person in power does not allow, should be prepared to respond in a positive way, in a strong way when so-called political supporters attack a female journalist in a truly abhorrent way, as we see happening online, the way Aliya has described the kind of threats that they received.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. I'm going with Nonoy. Could you tell us the situation of women journalists in Philippines? Are they facing the similar challenges that faced by the male journalist, or they have specific challenges, and how are you working, addressing them?
Well, to be honest about it, we have a very, very misogynistic president. This is a president who makes rape jokes in public, a president who actually attacks women for being women. And it has definitely made life more difficult for our women colleagues. And it's not that it's been easy for them even before Duterte. We, as a culture, the patriarchy is still very strong in the Philippines, probably because of our Spanish roots. We were a colony of Spain, and so the macho culture is still very, very embedded in us. And in the newsrooms, it's not so apparent, although we have had cases of colleague to colleague, or worse, superior to subordinate harassment. There have been cases of that, and but I think the worst cases are of, and especially because of the example set by our president, we have had reports of female journalists being propositioned by their sources. And I don't think it's a phenomenon exclusive to the Philippines, but given our culture, it's more. I guess it's more common than anywhere else. And the NUJP does have a program to address gender issues, but in the field, the respect of between colleagues is good, but it's when the women are in situations where there are power figures, and then that's when they're usually put on the spot. And unfortunately, the shame culture is also strong here, and so cases filed because of sexual harassment or misconduct are very, very still very, very rare. So oftentimes we're reduced to providing peer support to traumatized colleagues and hoping that they can move on from that. Otherwise, there's still a lot of work to do actually to improve conditions for our women colleagues.
Well, thank you.
And that's unfortunate given the fact that we do have many women executives in media. In fact, I think we have more women leaders now in media than males.
Well, that is really interesting that, media in Philippines have women in executive positions. There are many issues around, but we have very limited time. I'm going with Elisabeth Witchel again. What are the pressing issues that you want to, bring into public notice, that of the Asian region, or any reflections from the global initiatives that, stakeholders need to work making journalism a safe environment in all countries across the world. Elisabeth.
So I think that the important thing is to really look at it for stakeholders to approach it in a really holistic way. There's no magic answer. There's no one program that's going to ensure everyone's safety. It's really about bringing together a lot. It's a multi-pronged approach. You really need to look at the physical. You've got to look at the legal framework. You've got to keep the pressure up to address impunity, and you've got to keep working at building the kind of solidarity that is, and building a collaborative framework that isn't always going to be easy. You have people in government working with civil society and some of these coalitions, and it's not easy. It's not an intuitive marriage. It's going to take a lot of work for that relationship to turn to something productive. But I think it needs to be something that we keep evolving, that we keep sharing lessons between countries, and that again, as sort of people do any kind of look at this COVID period, that we really don't let some of the setbacks that have come to bear now really take hold. That we really try to reclaim some of the progress that we might have made in the past, and that we do not let some of the more repressive steps that have taken hold during COVID really take root.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. Aliya Iftikhar, what are your suggestions to the stakeholders, especially the governments in Asia region, both ending impunity and addressing the challenges posed by COVID-19 in the region?
In terms of ending impunity, I think, like Elisabeth said, it's really about keeping the pressure on. At this moment, especially when we're talking about governments taking advantage of the pandemic to, curtail and clamp down of freedom of expression, it can also be used as a moment to distract from many of those old cases or attacks against the press, attacks against journalism. And it's really important to keep pressing and to keep those stories in the spotlight. Don't let them fade away. And then beyond that, in terms of challenges that are brought by the pandemic itself and trying to report on the pandemic, I think that, journalists have to do the best that they can to try to keep getting that information and getting it to the public. And governments need to really take the values of transparency right now particularly seriously. They need to be, giving access to information, give journalists access to the data that they need. All of these things are really important, especially right now, in keeping the public informed and keeping the public safe.
Well, thank you, Aliya. Nonoy, the National Union of Journalists of Philippines is in protest as well, demonstrating with some demands in Philippines. How are you going to suggest the stakeholders of this region as well? Any reflection from your own initiatives in Philippines that other countries in the region also can work, protecting journalists from any kind of threat, ending impunity, and now addressing the challenges posed by the pandemic?
Well, if there's a bright side to what's happening now in the Philippines, I think it's actually the fact that journalists have come together like never before. We've totally cast off things like competition or working for competing companies, and just come together. Like yesterday, there were reporters and editors from competing networks and competing companies just out in the streets. And, the good thing is when push comes to shove, we do stand up. And the good thing is that people are beginning to stand up with us. And the only thing is, if we do get some change going, the challenge would be to sustain that and actually use that to push for more change. Because the problem is not so much the government that we have now. The problem is the system that allows the creation of such governments. And so I think we do have to change that, and that the media will never do without the people behind them. But having said that, I think it is also very, very important for the international community to continue pressuring our government, regardless of what Duterte may or may not think of, international pressure. Because just getting the word out, and more important, showing that international mechanisms for justice actually work, I think that is very, very important to send a message not only to governments, but to the people that it may work despite what is happening in their countries. It may work internationally. So I think that's very important. The support that we get from organizations like the CPJ, from IFJ, and other from IFEX and other freedom of expression coalitions is very, very important to us.
Well, thank you, Nonoy. There are many interesting issues, but time now to wrap up the show. But before I wrap up, I would like to request you to share your final insights that you want to share to our audience watching through our satellite TV and Facebook Live. Anything that I have left to ask you very quickly, starting from Aliya.
Well, I think that, this is a trying time, and many people are, suffering, and this is a tough time around the world. But if anything, I think it has really brought the importance of having a free press and having access to information. I think this is also a time, to be aware and to not let any of your rights or freedoms be curtailed, and to just keep pushing and, fighting for a free press and for your rights.
Well, thank you. Elisabeth, your final thoughts. Anything I left to ask you?
Well, I think I agree strongly with Aliya that we've come. I think we see now one of the advantages of, if you can call it an advantage of the crisis, is that news and the job of reporters is valued more than ever, and we, as Nonoy said, there's also more solidarity than ever. So let's kind of seize the moments and make sure that that we use this chance to work together and build solutions and build bridges. And
well, thank you. And Nonoy, your final thoughts.
Yes, basically, I'd like to actually address this to your viewers. If there's one lesson we in the Philippine media have learned, it's that to some extent we have kind of isolated ourselves from our audiences. But now we are going back and telling people, look, you need to be with us, because press freedom is not owned by the press. This is it is owned by the people. It's just a freedom that we wield to serve your right to know. And I think when people understand that, people will get behind us, and that will make us stronger, definitely.
Well, thank you, Nonoy. Well, we have now come to the end of this show. I'd like to thank all of you. We are today joined by Mr. Nonoy Espina. He's the chairman of National Union of Journalists of Philippines. Then we were also joined by Ms. Elisabeth Witchel, expert on freedom of expression. And we are also joined by Ms. Aliya Iftikhar, senior researcher of the Asia program, Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you, each one of you. Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.